But before we get to Daniel chapter 5, there's a word I want to talk about, and that word is honor, or to honor. Like, what does it mean? I looked it up, and a few things that I could spot that made sense to me is to glorify. And for a knife, the glory of a knife is to cut. The glory of scissors is to cut, right? The glory of man is to obey God. So if you're going to honor, you're going to obey somebody. If it's a person above you, or if it's anybody, you're going to obey somebody, but most importantly, you're going to obey God. You can glorify, you can magnify. Magnify means praise, to speak highly of. To treat with admiration and respect is a way to honor somebody. And we don't talk about honoring people very much in classes and that, but it's really important because you have to ask, who are we to honor? Well, I think the first one is obvious, and that's God. And in 1 Timothy, Paul gives Timothy a list of people that we need to be honoring. The first one, to the King, eternal, immortal, invisible, the only God, be honor and glory forever and ever. So absolutely, we have to honor God and honor God first. But then he goes off in chapter 5 and he says, honor the widows, who are widows, true indeed. Honor the elders of the church, the leadership of the church. Even slaves are supposed to honor their masters, you know. That's the way you treat other people. And then he finishes it in chapter 6, verse 16, and he finishes it. So he starts with God, and he gives us the widows. He gives us the elders, the masters, and then he finishes with God, who alone possesses immortality, let's see, and dwells in unapproachable light, whom no man has seen or can see. To him be honor and eternal dominion. Amen. And so there's a list of people that we need to honor. Paul, or whoever wrote Hebrews, chapter 13, verse 4, says you have to honor marriages, honor the marriage bed. First Peter picks it up and says you have to honor all people. Treat all people with respect, right? And admiration, all people. And then he goes on to say, especially your wife. I guess he made sure that some guys would include their wives as people, right? But he says that in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7, you have to. And I was wondering, what's a neat way to honor people? And I think Paul says in Ephesians chapter 2, probably the best way to treat people is do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourself. Do not merely look out for your own personal interest, but the interest of others. If you're looking out for the interests of others, that's how you can honor people. And we have to ask ourselves, am I really living up to what God calls me to do? Am I learning to honor all people, right? And if I fail to honor, what happens? Well, the major consequence, if you fail to honor God, Romans, what is it, chapter 1, verse 21 and following, for even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise became fools, exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for the image in the form of corruptible man. Therefore, because they did not honor him, God gave them over in the lust of their hearts to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. For this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions for one another. And then God gave them over to a depraved mind. You have to learn to fully honor God and treat him with full admiration and respect. And if you can learn to honor God, then you're going to learn to honor other people. And that's so important. And if you don't honor other people, guess what? You're not honoring God because you represent God. And you're God's child. And is this how a child of God acts? Is this how a child of God should treat another human being? You have to be careful with that, right? And there's there's a warning. What was it? Oh, the warning that he says, I like this. In verse 30 of staying with Romans, the depraved mind will be slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy. And it's disobedient to parents is what you need to look at. And that's a very popular thing that's happening in this world today. And Timothy is given that same warning in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2. Men will be lovers of self. Well, in verse 1, realize in the last days, difficult times will come. And I'm still kind of not sure of what the last days that he's referring to Timothy. If it's back in Timothy's time, well, then it doesn't seem to apply to us. But if it's in our day and age, in the last days before the second coming of Christ, then it does apply to us. And we can see this happening. And he says, in the last days, men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, malicious gossips. That's rampant everywhere, right? But again, back to that idea of disobedient to parents. Jesus brings this up in 2 places about how you are to treat your mother and your father, disobedient to parents. Matthew 15:4, and he adds another verse to it just to get us to understand how we really need to honor. If you can't honor your parents, you're not going to honor other people. Put it this way, right? Why do you yourselves transgress the commandment of God for the sake of your traditions? And this is Matthew chapter 15, verse 4. For God said, honor your father and mother. He who speaks evil of father or mother is to be put to death. And he repeats that in Mark as well. That's not in the text right there. Because in the commandments, we're looking at the 5th commandment this morning, and that is to honor your father and mother, right? But he who speaks evil of his father and mother is in the next chapter. So the 10 commandments, we find in Exodus chapter 20. But in Exodus chapter 21 is where Jesus pulls this out, and he says out of verse 17, he who curses his father or mother shall be put to death. And prior to that, he who strikes his father or mother shall be put to death. Kind of interesting, the seriousness of how we need to treat our loved ones, because we have a tendency to put the loved ones off on the side and we don't treat them with honor, right? Because you're always around them. And well, I guess it's the same reason why he said, husbands, treat your wives with honor. Because you're always there in one another's presence, and you just take for granted the things they do, right? And the children take for granted what the parents do and have expectations of the parents. But you have to teach the kids to honor you, because if they do not honor you, if they do not respect you, they're not going to respect authority. And they're going to be a detriment to society. And they're going to be an embarrassment to yourself if you don't teach them that. And we ourselves need to understand we're going to be an embarrassment to Christ. And I don't know if I can make it if I'm not obeying God's word and learning to honor the brethren, honor other people. Because if you don't honor them, you put yourself above them and you're in that arrogant attitude. And as Paul says, if you want to be great, you got to be humble. Or Jesus says, who's the greatest among you? Is the servant, the one that serves. I've got to learn to honor, and I've got to learn correctly. I mean, Jesus on the cross, it pains every time he speaks. It pains him. But from the cross, what did he say? Looking at John. No, he said to his mother, woman, behold your son. And then he said to the disciple, behold your mother. He made sure his mom was taken care of. And that must have pained him greatly just to say those words, right? Because every breath was excruciating. But he shows us the example to take care of those that we love. There is no excuse not to honor your father and mother. If your parents are Christians, well, then they can help you in your walk with God. If your parents are Christians, you really need to be super thankful. And I think, and I've always thought that, okay, these two ladies were, well, obviously they were Jewish, but but I don't think it was their Jewishness. I think it was their Christianity. Because Paul writes to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5, he says, I am mindful of the sincere faith within you, which first dwelt in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice. And I'm sure that it is in you as well, right? And I don't think he's referring to the faith that they had as Jews. I think they see the faith that they became Christians. And I think grandma became first, mom became second, and then he was able to understand Christianity through them. And he needs to honor them. You got to honor your grandparents. They don't even mention it. It's an absolute, right? But this is so important. If they are Christians, you need to be thankful to them. If they are not Christians, your parents, you have to honor them to set an example for them, right? Because they're going to say, oh, is this how a Christian treats his parents? If they're non-Christian, you have to honor them even more. And the number one thing you have to do is what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 16, 14, and 15. You have to forgive them. And I had a friend whose father sexually abused him, which set him in a world of hurt because he was running down that world of drugs because all he could do is remember what happened when he was 3 and 4 years old. And I just pulled him aside and I said, look, what you got to do is you got to forgive your dad because you haven't forgiven your dad yet. Because once you can forgive your dad, then you can put it all behind you and get on with your life. But you're always rooting around in that and not forgiving him. Even if your dad doesn't ask for forgiveness, forgive him. Because your dad is going to pay a penalty in a place called hell. And nobody wants even your worst enemy to go to a place called hell. So hell's kind of an interesting place because it's a justice. You know there's justice for people out there. You don't want that kind of justice to people. So you have to learn to forgive. And that's a big one, to forgive for those kinds of atrocities. But it'll make you the person that you need to be as far as a Christian is concerned. I mean, what does Jesus say? From the cross, forgive them. They know not what they do. You don't know how your parents were raised by their parents and their grandparents, and you can't hold that against them. You have to just forgive and move on because this world is so short, right? That's what we need to understand. So I'm bringing all this up. Why? Because honor is so important, because if you don't, it spells disaster in your life. And that's what Daniel chapter 5 is all about. Because in Daniel chapter 5, which is honor your father and mother, here we have Belshazzar. Now Belshazzar, this is 538 BC. The Medes and the Persians are outside. They're battling with the Babylonians. Actually, they're going to reroute the river, and the river's going to flow, and they're going to walk through the dry water bed that very night, and they're going to conquer Babylon without destroying it and without killing anybody but Belshazzar himself, right? So this is his last night. But the reason for his last night is why? Because he doesn't honor his parents. Particularly, he doesn't honor his father, Nebuchadnezzar. Now, Nebuchadnezzar's his great-grandfather. But as far as genealogy is concerned, he's your father. If you ever read, when you're reading in Kings, what does it say? You know, he's the son of David. He's the son of David, right? Well, he's not. He's 100 years after David, but it's always the king is the son of David. And that's how you need to see it. And that's what Belshazzar is. He's only about 50 years after the death of Nebuchadnezzar. As a matter of fact, less, I'd say 30 years. So he knows Nebuchadnezzar. And in fact, if you just drop in chapter 5, if you just drop to verse 22, it's such a heavy And this is Daniel looking at him and saying, yet you, his son Belshazzar, speaking of Nebuchadnezzar, he just explained Nebuchadnezzar. His son Belshazzar have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. You know all of this. Don't plead ignorance. You know the whole story of your father Nebuchadnezzar. You know everything that he went through, and yet you didn't humble yourself. You didn't honor your father. In fact, you became arrogant and you want to do whatever you're going to do. And you're going to show how superior you are to your father. You don't even care about the Medes and the Persians outside because you think you are indestructible. You think they can't defeat me. As a matter of fact, you're so proud of yourself, you're going to throw a party for 1,000 people, a great feast. And as you sit down to drink the wine, you go, oh, wait, I got to have more. What does he do? He gave orders to bring, verse 2, the gold and silver vessels, which Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. He is blatantly mocking God. He knows these things have been taken from Jerusalem, and he's always wanted them. Nebuchadnezzar had them stored. Nebuchadnezzar honored God. And that's what we saw back in chapter 4 when he came to his senses. Then he wrote chapter 4 and sent it to all the world saying, God is the God of. And everybody needs to honor the God of Daniel, right? I think he's probably in heaven, Nebuchadnezzar, from the way he changed his life. Hopefully so. No, he didn't get baptized. But no, back in that period in time, it's interesting how God worked with people. So he calls for the glasses. The glasses come, or the mugs, because they're made of gold and silver. And then verse 4, they drank the wine, praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. I am greater than my grandfather. I am not into this God that he's brought into this world. And I'm going to show you how good we are. We're going to drink from his cups. And we're not going to be fearful. But then, suddenly, the fingers of a man's hand, the hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. Like it's just this floating hand. This is a room that's sitting 1,000 people. So he's got some mighty big walls and tall ceiling, and everybody can see this hand starting to write on the wall. And look at his response. His face grew pale. His thoughts alarmed him. Now, I think that's really interesting. His thoughts alarmed him. Why? Because he knows he's mocking God, right? And now he knows he's in muko trouble, right? And his hip joints went slack. He can't stand. He slumped down in his chair. And the neatest thing is his knees began knocking together, right? Can you just imagine how terrified you would have to be for your knees to be knocking together? Like he knows he's made a major mistake by grabbing these utensils. He knows by not honoring his father and respecting the God that made his father be humbled. I'm not like that. No, you're worse. The king called in the concubines, the Chaldeans, and they all come. And they said, we can't understand this. You can give us the purple clothes. You can give us the chain around the neck. You can make us third in command. But there's no way we can interpret what's written on the wall. Then all the king's wise men could not read it. And then, verse 9, King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed. His face grew paler, and his nobles were perplexed. What's wrong? Well, he knows about Daniel, though he claims he doesn't. He knows everything about Nebuchadnezzar. And what happened when Nebuchadnezzar had the dream in chapter 2? None of the Chaldeans, nobody could interpret it, right? Except for Daniel. And now none of these guys can interpret it. So now he knows he's dealing with God of the universe. Now he knows he's monstrously. That's why he's greatly alarmed, because now his thoughts are going, man, are we messed up, right? The queen comes. I don't know who the queen is. I don't think it's his wife. It could be the queen mother. It could be his mom. Whoever she is enters. She has to be older. She heard what's going on, and she says, there's a man in the kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of your father, illumination, insight, wisdom, and the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, appointed him chief of the magicians, the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners. This was because an extraordinary spirit of knowledge and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare. Like, whatever the queen mother just said, just buried him, right? Because now he knows I got to call Daniel. Now I know I'm in a mess of hurt, right? So bring in Daniel, he's got to be like a puddle on his chair, this guy. And the king, Daniel, was brought in before the king. Are you that Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father, the king, brought from Judah? Now I have heard about you that a spirit of the gods is in you. That should be a major warning. And that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom have been found in you. Just now the wise men and the conjurers were brought in before me that they might read the inscription, but they couldn't. But I personally have heard about you, that you're able to give interpretation. Drop down to verse 18. Here's Daniel. O king, the Most High God granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, majesty to Nebuchadnezzar, your father. That's what Nebuchadnezzar had to realize, that it all comes from God. You do not create yourself. God allows you. God blesses you. You always have to give honor and glory back to God. You always have to give God thanks because of the grandeur which he has bestowed on him. All the peoples, nations, men of every language feared and trembled before him. Whomever he wished he killed, whomever he wished he spared alive, whomever he wished he elevated, and whomever he wished he humbled. All because of what God had given him. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit became so proud that he behaved arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne, and his glory was taken away from him. He was also driven from mankind. His heart was made like that of the beasts, and his dwelling place was with the wild donkeys. He was given grass to eat like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of the heaven until he recognized that the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind, and that he sets over it whomever he wishes. And that's what he wrote in chapter 4. And then Daniel says, yet you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. Everything I just repeated is just a reminder that you already know about God. You know how incredible he is. You know about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And here you are mocking him. Here you are playing games with God. You have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before you. You and your nobles, your wives, your concubines have been drinking from them and have praised the gods of silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, stone, which do not see, hear, or understand, but the God in whose hand are your life breath and all your ways you have not glorified. Therefore, the hand was sent from him, and the inscription was written out. And the interpretation, verse 26, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Perez, your kingdom has been divided, given to the Medes and the Persians. And I guess in his last ditch effort to save himself, Belshazzar gave orders and they clothed Daniel with purple, put a neck of gold around his neck, and issued a proclamation concerning him. He is now, he had authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. Daniel says, I don't care. That same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. And that was the end of him, right? And that's right where the fifth commandment falls, on the fifth chapter. And it falls to Belshazzar, a man that did not know how to honor his father. And if you do not honor your father, what happens? Well, Jesus said, if you don't honor it, I'm sorry, you deserve death, is what he's saying. In Ephesians, like, we don't kill people for not honoring, but in Ephesians, what does he say? So that your life, and now this is kind of an interesting statement. Children, obey your parents, Ephesians chapter 6. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth. Yeah, so you may live a good long life, right? And accomplish a lot of good things. Because the way you live your life is how you honor your parents, the life that you live. So the parents can go, yes, I am proud of my son, right? He's obeyed the things that we've taught him and he's grown up to be a fine young man. That's how you honor the parents. And you'll live a long life. Belshazzar did not understand this at all and totally disregarded his father. And I put down in my notes, my new handout, I changed it. I hope, honor your parents. But it doesn't say that. It says honor your father and your mother, right? You got to have honor both. Both deserve equal honor, not just parents, but your father and your mother. It is so important to see that. And then in the bottom of my notes, I put down what? I put down salt of the earth after this chapter. Salt of the earth, because what Jesus is saying in Matthew chapter 5, the reason this world continues to turn is because there's Christians in this world. Verse 13 to verse 16 of Matthew, Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth. If the salt's become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You're the light of the world, a city set on a hill that cannot be hidden. Nor does anyone light a lamp but put it under a basket, but put it on a lampstand and so that it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Honor your Father who is in heaven. Glorify your Father. As long as we continue to honor, not just God, widows, those who need our help, we need to be looking to those that struggle, the weak, the helpless, the widows, as James says, orphans as well. You got to honor the elders. You got to honor your wife. Sorry how I say that. But just to bring it home, right? It's got to come home to me. You got to, the elders, you got to honor all people, honor the king, which is the prime minister. Speak highly of, or don't speak at all, right? But that's who we are. And if we lose the fact of our ability to honor, to speak highly of others, we join the world and all we do is criticize and condemn other people. That's for God to do, not for us to do. We need to build people up. If you can't say anything, don't say anything. This is pretty much the thing we need to see here. But beware of the lesson that's coming to us from Daniel, especially from Belshazzar. He did not honor, and God said, your time's up, because he knew the guy wasn't going to change. Time's up, get a new king. spared all the Jews in Babylon. The Medes and Persians took it over just easily. And the only one that died was the mocker. Be careful of mockery. And that's the lesson I'm pulling out of Daniel chapter 5. Thank you.